We're terminating you effective immediately. Security will escort you out. He didn't even look up from his tablet. Just read the line like a script someone had handed him. No handshake. No explanation. Just a trembling HR rep hovering behind him like she was watching someone disarm a bomb with a plastic spoon. I froze for half a second, just long enough to notice the way Bradley Patterson Jr.'s designer haircut caught the fluorescent lobby light, the way his crisp, new Stanford MBA diploma glimmered behind him on the wall, and how his whole posture screamed, "I'm your superior now." I'd trained him. I'd taught him how to read balance sheets and cash flow statements. I'd sat him down in my office for hours, explaining the intricacies of client contracts, supplier agreements, and warehouse operations. And now this kid, barely old enough to shave without regret, was trying to fire me on day one. I didn't flinch. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and handed over my badge with the calm you only get from 28 years of running logistics operations and 6 years in the Navy before that. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. All I said was, "Tell your father the board meeting in 3 hours should be interesting." And then I walked out. The lobby didn't feel the same on the way back in. The security guard who had escorted me out 3 hours earlier now nodded, almost respectfully, as if acknowledging I hadn't just been fired, I'd been underestimated. The receptionist, who had avoided eye contact during my termination, smiled faintly and directed me to conference room A. They all knew, even before I said a word, that something was about to change. Bradley Jr. probably thought he was celebrating. Maybe he was drafting a LinkedIn post about embracing digital transformation or eliminating outdated thinking. #leadership goals, #innovation, #nextgen CEO, hashtags queued, proud of a decision he didn't even understand the legal ramifications of. Meanwhile, I'd already triggered what I like to call the bulletproof plan. 3 decades in logistics, a Navy career that taught me patience, and 28 years of quietly building equity in anchor point logistics had prepared me for this exact moment. See, here's the thing nobody ever told Bradley Jr. Inheriting a title doesn't mean inheriting control. Titles are plastic. Authority is written in contracts, coded in clauses, backed by legal precedent, and earned over years of work. For 28 years, I'd been quietly acquiring stakes, stock options, voting shares, not for vanity or corner offices, but for protection. Because while the company was lauded in glossy brochures, I was the foundation beneath it. I was the guy who'd stabilized operations when the CFO quit midstream, who'd negotiated investor deals when everyone else was distracted by shiny office toys, and who'd kept the company solvent when revenue streams threatened to dry up. By the time Bradley Jr. strutted into the CEO office with his fresh veneer and MBA arrogance, I was sitting on 72% equity. 72%. Not flashy. Not publicized. Not visible in company profiles. But in a corporate coup, it's everything. Section 12B, buried in the shareholder agreement, written by me after a cousin of Junior's tried to fire half the warehouse staff in a tantrum years ago, had one simple rule: if a non-equity executive terminated a founding team member without board approval, their authority was suspended immediately. And by immediately, I mean the clock starts ticking the moment the termination is executed. While Junior thought he was firing me, I was activating the very clause he never read, the clause he couldn't even comprehend. I had hand-delivered certified copies to every board member, investor, and general counsel tied to Anchor Point Logistics before he'd typed a single line in his new CEO welcome email. By the time he realized what he'd done, the emergency meeting had already begun. I didn't rush. I never do. Power, true power, isn't about speed or loud proclamations. It's about patience. About letting the other person sprint blindfolded toward a cliff while you already know where the edge is. Bradley Jr. had sprinted. And now, it was time for gravity. After leaving the lobby, I walked past his corner office. I saw him on the phone, probably calling every MBA buddy he had, searching for a solution, an escape, some confirmation that what he had done was okay. His polished veneer was cracking. His hands shook over the keyboard. The first signs of panic. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to argue. The law, the contracts, the clauses I had built into the company over decades, they would speak louder than anything I could say. And they already had. By the time the board's executive assistants opened the envelopes I'd hand-delivered, they were holding more than paper. They were holding the skeleton key to the company, a map of authority that Junior had never been taught to read. Certified, notarized, time-stamped. Every equity breakdown, every shareholder vote, every approval of mine meticulously recorded and indisputable. Section 12B was live. I took the elevator to the 12th floor, calm, measured, as if I were going to a morning briefing instead of executing the final act of a 3-decade chess game. Security nodded respectfully. The receptionist smiled. They knew. I wasn't just returning, I was reclaiming. Inside the conference room, 8 faces looked at me with a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and relief. Bradley Sr., the founder, sat at the far end, trying to maintain composure. His golf shirt was wrinkled, hair disheveled, hands shaking slightly. He'd spent the morning in denial, calling meetings and trying to reason with his own son. Now, he realized the scale of Junior's mistake. I didn't sit down. Not yet. I opened my briefcase with the same precision I used to open a Navy-issued map, pulled out a single document, and placed it in front of the board. As majority shareholder of Anchor Point Logistics, I said, voice calm, controlled, I formally request a binding vote to rescind all executive appointments made in the previous 48 hours, pending comprehensive shareholder review. Silence. Pure, thick, expectant silence. You could feel it in the air, the weight of decades of decisions, contracts, and trust all pressing down on one moment. The board chair, Harold Weinstein, cleared his throat. Motion received and logged. Emergency session is now in order under Section 12B protocols. Finally, I sat in my chair. The one at the head of the table. I had earned over 28 years of stabilizing, building, and defending this company. My nameplate, freshly printed, Charles Patterson, majority shareholder. Junior burst in 5 minutes later. Face flushed, eyes wide, phone clutched like a life preserver. What's going on? Why wasn't I informed about this meeting? I'm the CEO. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time that day. This was the kid who had sat in my office years ago asking questions about freight coordination. Who had called me Uncle Chuck until he got his MBA and decided he was ready to inherit the throne. You don't have the authority to call emergency board meetings, I said calmly. You never did. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. The color drained from his face. The room seemed to tilt. This wasn't a corporate lecture. It wasn't some theory from a case study. This was reality. Legal, binding, and unstoppable. I'm the CEO, he stammered, looking around the room for allies who weren't there. Harold spoke, gentle but firm. Bradley, your appointment was conditional and derivative. You hold no equity stake. Section 12B was triggered by your unilateral termination of a founding member. Ridiculous! Junior shouted, voice cracking. Chuck, You can't seriously want to destroy everything my father built. I leaned back, calm, unshakable. Your father didn't build this alone. He built it with partners. I'm one of them. Partners don't get fired by their junior employees. The vote began. One by one, hands went up. CFO, operations lead, investor representatives. Even Bradley Sr., after a long pause that seemed eternal, raised his hand. 8-0. Unanimous. The motion passed. Junior's appointment was rescinded. For the first time, I watched him comprehend the full scope of his failure. The termination he'd been so proud of, the power move he thought would cement his legacy, had instead triggered the very clause that removed him from power entirely. He tried to protest, stammer, bargain. None of it worked. The board, the law, the contracts, and decades of meticulous preparation had all conspired to render him powerless. By 4:30 p.m., I was back in my office. The same office I'd occupied for 15 years before the company had modernized for the benefit of the founder's heir and his shiny innovation lab. Nameplate restored. Desk exactly where it had been. Authority fully reclaimed. Junior escorted out. Permanently. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bradley Sr. remained as president but now reported to me. Even he understood, for the first time, the value of experience over entitlement. The company didn't miss a beat. Drivers kept routes. Warehouse staff kept jobs. Clients kept shipments on time. Only the decision-maker had changed. Sometimes power is quiet. Sometimes it's invisible until you activate it. And sometimes, when entitled leadership collides with earned authority, revenge is not just poetic, it's permanent. Junior didn't disappear quietly. Oh no, that would have been too simple. Instead, he became a walking cautionary tale, the kind everyone whispers about in boardrooms and elevator rides. I watched from my office window as he stomped out of the building, his expensive Italian loafers scuffing against the marble floors, phone glued to his ear, shouting at someone. Probably a consultant, probably a friend, maybe even his father, trying desperately to convince the world that he hadn't just walked into a trap he built himself. I didn't laugh. Not yet. Patience, as I've learned, is a weapon far sharper than any witty retort. I simply returned to my desk, sipped a lukewarm coffee, and let the storm unfold. Within 30 minutes, emails started hitting my inbox. Not the usual memos or logistics reports, but frantic notes from senior staff, investors, and even Bradley Sr.'s personal assistant. Each one read like a mini heart attack in text form. Is it true? Did Section 12B really activate? What do we do next? Your authority is uncontested. The tension wasn't mine. It was theirs. I had already rehearsed this outcome for over 28 years. By 5 p.m., Junior's LinkedIn had been flooded, though I'm certain he didn't write a single word himself. Someone on his team posted, "Leadership is about tough decisions for long-term growth." He probably thought it sounded clever. I thought it tragic. Because the only tough decision he'd made that day was to fire someone who couldn't legally be fired, and it backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The next morning, the office hummed with quiet curiosity. No dramatic emails from me. No grand announcements. Just business as usual. And yet, everyone knew the truth. The person who had been orchestrating operations behind the scenes for decades had finally reclaimed their rightful authority. I walked past the logistics floor, past the warehouse, past the client services team, and each person nodded, smiled, or gave a subtle thumbs up. They weren't cheering for me. They were cheering for justice. Bradley Sr. finally asked to speak privately. We went to his old office, the one he'd occupied before the new innovative leadership shuffle. He leaned back in his chair, eyes tired but clear, and admitted quietly, "I let family cloud my judgment. I wanted to trust him, and I ignored experience. I see now that I was wrong." I nodded, understanding. "It's not just about family, sir. It's about the company surviving. That's what matters." He sighed and shook his head. "He's lucky I didn't resign in anger," he said, half laughing, half grieving. "But then again, maybe I should have." I smiled faintly, letting him think it was his insight alone. Little victories are sweeter when they are savored by the other side without interference. Meanwhile, Junior was in full damage control mode. Calls from recruiters, consultants, former classmates, even random strangers offering to help him rebuild his brand. None of it mattered. His reputation in the company, and with the investors, had already been tarnished. The boy who thought power was a title learned the hard way that power is earned, not given, and certainly not inherited without accountability. And I stayed in my office, reviewing contracts, equity agreements, and operational reports. I didn't need to gloat. The satisfaction of watching someone overconfident crash into the very rules they ignored is a private pleasure, one that doesn't require applause. The real revenge isn't the embarrassment. It's the restoration of order, the confirmation that experience, patience, and preparation trump entitlement every single time. Over the following days, whispers spread through the city. Anchor Point Logistics wasn't just surviving the junior CEO debacle, it was thriving. Investors called, reassured themselves, and doubled down on their commitments. Employees walked taller, knowing the person who had been silently steering the company all along was finally in control. Junior's father, Bradley Sr., had to adjust. He stopped treating the company as a family sandbox and started treating it as a legacy, one I now controlled in practical terms, though he still held the ceremonial title of president. It was an uneasy partnership, but one grounded in mutual respect for what could be lost if inexperience ran unchecked. And what of Junior? He sent emails, LinkedIn posts, even a few half-hearted attempts to contact me. I didn't respond. I let him stew. Sometimes the best revenge is invisibility, letting someone drown in the consequences of their own arrogance. Weeks later, during a board review, I walked into the room and saw him. Sitting quietly in the observer section, hoping, probably, to find a crack in my authority. He didn't. Not a single fissure. Every motion, every vote, every operational decision reflected the reality he had created for himself, powerless, watched, and irrelevant. I leaned back in my chair, watching, waiting. That is when it truly hit me. Revenge isn't always dramatic. It isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's silent. It's legal, procedural, irrevocable. It's the kind of satisfaction that doesn't need celebration, because the proof is in the results. The company, the board, the employees, they all knew who the real leader was. Junior? He was history. And as I walked through the halls of Anchor Point Logistics that day, I realized something else. The lesson extended beyond him, beyond the immediate drama. Anyone who underestimates the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who build authority where it isn't visible, will eventually pay the price. Sometimes revenge isn't a moment. It's a process. It's a lifetime of preparation condensed into one day of reckoning. And as I glanced at my office, my desk, my nameplate, Charles Patterson, majority shareholder, I knew that I had not only survived the storm but had turned it into a lesson that would echo through every corner of the company for years to come. Because the truth is simple, titles can be taken. Offices can be reassigned. Bonuses can be cut. But control, authority, and influence built over decades? That cannot be snatched away by arrogance, youth, or entitlement. Only earned patience can do that. And let me tell you, I had earned every inch of it. The days following Junior's dramatic fall were a masterclass in patience and observation. I didn't rush to show dominance. That's amateur behavior, the kind that gets people fired, humiliated, or worse, trapped in their own hubris. No, I let the aftermath breathe, let it settle into every corner of Anchor Point logistics, let the ripples of his arrogance echo through every department. The boardroom, which had once been a place of theoretical debates and polite nods, became the theater of silent authority. Investors, previously anxious about change, began sending subtle signals of confidence. Emails marked urgent now carried a new subtext. They weren't questioning me. They were acknowledging the unspoken truth. Anchor Point was now mine to steer, not because I had been appointed, not because anyone handed me a title, but because I had earned it. Bradley Jr., of course, did not take this lightly. I started noticing subtle attempts to re-enter the picture, whispered phone calls, LinkedIn connections, even invitations to strategic planning sessions where he wasn't welcome. He was flailing, trying to find a crack in the armor that simply wasn't there. I let him. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in watching someone exhaust every resource, every relationship, every ounce of energy, only to realize that the rules of engagement are not written for them. While he was scrambling, I quietly initiated a series of strategic maneuvers to solidify control. Board realignment. I scheduled meetings with key board members individually, revisiting agreements and reaffirming my role as majority shareholder. Not in an aggressive way, they already knew my history, but to make it indisputable, legally and psychologically. By the time any discussion about Junior's return could arise, every board member had signed off on continuity protocols. Investor reassurance. I personally contacted every major investor, walked them through the Section 12B activation, and explained why the company was now more secure than ever. I didn't have to boast. I simply presented facts: equity, voting power, operational stability, compliance with SEC and corporate bylaws. Each call ended the same way, with silence, followed by affirmation. Anchor Point's foundation was bulletproof. Operational control. While Junior had been obsessing over emails, dashboards, and digital transformation initiatives, I reviewed contracts, vendor agreements, and client relationships. I ensured no single department could bypass established procedures, that reporting lines were clear, and that every critical decision required either my approval or board consensus. Junior's impulsive restructuring ideas now had nowhere to land. And yet, the final piece of satisfaction came not from contracts or control, but from watching Junior's slow, painful recognition of reality. I first noticed the change during a routine walkthrough. He was in the lobby, trying to collect himself, dressed in a suit that suddenly looked too big on him, the kind of ill-fitting armor someone buys when they realize that confidence isn't enough to fill it. He spotted me, eyes widening, and for a brief, glorious second, I saw recognition, then panic. He wanted confrontation. He wanted to argue, explain, negotiate, all the things the unprepared think will work when logic and legality fail them. But I didn't approach. I let him stew in the knowledge that every attempt he made to regain control was already invalidated by law, by contracts, by 30 years of preparation. By the second week, whispers of his failed takeover began leaking outside the building. MBA forums, corporate gossip channels, even financial news sites caught wind of the CEO's son undone by legal clause he didn't understand. Each mention was another nail in the coffin of his credibility. While he tried to salvage appearances, the narrative had shifted permanently. I'll admit, I allowed small acts of psychological pressure too. Nothing overt, just enough for him to feel the weight of his miscalculation. A strategically scheduled board review during his supposed strategy session. Gentle mentions of Section 12B in casual investor calls. Subtle operational reminders to department heads about chain of command. He began to realize that his power was purely performative. He could sit in a corner office, use the fancy title, but actual authority? That had been stripped, invisibly, irreversibly. And unlike the impulsive show of firing me, I was quiet, patient, invisible, and untouchable. Weeks later, I finally let a small, controlled ripple reach the outside world. Not a press release, not a statement, just an official notification to investors, clients, and key partners. I highlighted the stability of the company, the solidification of governance protocols, and subtly referenced the importance of earned authority in corporate leadership. Junior didn't understand why this caused whispers. To him, it was a minor memo. To everyone else, it was confirmation. The man who had been silently running operations for decades was now officially in control. His brand, carefully curated and polished for years, began to unravel. He reached out one final time, attempting a meeting under the guise of reconciliation and strategic advice. I declined politely, with a nod to professionalism but no concessions. That's when it hit him fully. No apology, no charm, no MBA title, no family connection could restore what he had destroyed in a single day. The greatest satisfaction, of course, came from watching his father come to terms with it. Bradley Sr. had to reconcile decades of pride with the reality of governance. We never discussed it in detail publicly. Just a few quiet words, shared in his office. You were right all along. I wasn't looking for validation. Just making sure the company survived. And you did. Every day we've worked together, I thought I understood the company. But this was beyond me. I didn't respond, just let the moment exist. It wasn't about ego. It was about proof. Proof that patience, preparation, and strategic intelligence always outlast arrogance and entitlement. By the end of the month, the company had stabilized completely. Junior had faded into the background, occasionally seen at industry events but without influence, without authority, without the ability to harm what I had worked so long to protect. And I returned to operations, to contracts, to employees, to logistics. The same company, same responsibilities, same office, only now, with the unmistakable truth written in every file, every contract, and every board decision. The real power was mine, legally and permanently. Revenge, I realized, isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, procedural. It's built into contracts, encoded in clauses, and reinforced over decades. And when executed perfectly, it doesn't just punish arrogance, it validates patience, experience, and foresight. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest, the flashiest, or the youngest. It's the one who has been building quietly, patiently, for decades. And that person? That's me. Junior didn't learn quietly. That would have been too easy. No, he tried everything. Soft power, guilt, charm, subtle manipulation. Each attempt a desperate flail to regain control of a kingdom he'd never earned. And I watched it all unfold like a general surveying a battlefield he'd already won. It started with emails, subtle and almost polite. Can we discuss strategy? Then phone calls, always at inconvenient times, always trailing off when I picked up. Finally, he showed up at the building, dressed in a suit that suddenly looked like armor for a battle he had no weapons for. I saw him walking through the lobby, flanked by his assistant, trying to project authority. Trying, but failing. I didn't meet him in the lobby. I didn't acknowledge him. Instead, I let the security team, the receptionist, even the floor managers handle him. Each one knew the truth now. The person in charge was me, not him. Watching him stumble through a building where he'd once been presumed king was a lesson in silent humiliation. The next day, I received an anonymous tip, or so he thought, from someone claiming to have insider information about a contract he was trying to influence. He had sent legal memos, spreadsheets, and proposals in an attempt to sway vendors and investors. All of it carefully countered by pre-existing clauses I had built over decades. Junior's frustration began to mount visibly. Emails came faster, more frantic. Every time he tried to initiate change, the board, investors, or department heads quietly reminded him, authority lies with Charles Patterson, majority shareholder. The subtle, relentless enforcement of Section 12B had created a perfect storm. He was active but impotent, vocal but powerless. And then came the audacious attempt. He thought he could rally a few board members to challenge my authority, exploit a technicality, or even threaten litigation. I anticipated this. Months earlier, I had quietly documented every transaction, every shareholder vote, every procedural requirement, every time-stamped contract, all notarized, all ready. When the first meeting request arrived, I smiled. Because I didn't have to argue. I had already won. The meeting was scheduled. Junior walked in, visibly nervous, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat. He expected allies, he expected debate, he expected a crack in the armor. Instead, he was met with 8 faces of calm, experienced authority. Harold Weinstein, the board chair, didn't even glance at him. He simply asked me to present. I laid out every detail, the equity percentages, the legal clauses, the activation of Section 12B, and the consequences of any attempt to challenge it. The room was silent, every word slicing through Junior's facade. When I finished, I sat down. The power dynamic couldn't have been clearer. Bradley Jr. stammered, searching for words. This isn't fair. I'm the CO. I looked at him, calmly, each word deliberate. You were never the CEO. Your appointment was conditional, derivative, and entirely dependent on board approval. Section 12B was triggered the moment you attempted to terminate me. Everything else, your title, your office, your responsibilities, evaporated the instant you acted outside authority. The room was still. He could say nothing. He could argue nothing. Every attempt to regain footing was legally and procedurally impossible. His youthful arrogance had collided with 3 decades of preparation, and the collision was catastrophic. Over the next few weeks, Junior tried to maintain relevance, corporate events, board invitations, even casual interactions with employees. Each time, I let the smallest detail remind him of reality. A board member would glance at him and shake their head. A department lead would respond politely but ignore his instructions. Even clients, tipped off by carefully managed communications, began asking questions about his authority. One afternoon, I watched him in the lobby, holding a coffee, attempting to project calm. An employee passed, smiled, and said quietly, "Mr. Patterson, should we follow Mr. Junior's instructions or yours?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine. Junior's face fell, color draining. He had no answer. Authority isn't earned in the cafeteria. It's demonstrated through results, respect, and legal recognition. And by now, everyone knew exactly where it resided. Even Bradley Sr. had stopped intervening. He had finally internalized the truth. Experience, strategy, and preparation matter more than bloodlines or charm. Junior was alone in his struggle. By the end of the month, all doubts had dissipated. Contracts signed, voting protocols followed, operational control reinforced. My presence was no longer questioned. Employees, investors, and board members alike understood Charles Patterson was in charge. The boy who had attempted a coup was a cautionary tale whispered in hallways and corporate forums. And the revenge? Complete. Silent. Legal. Permanent. Not a shred of it relied on dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. Every step was procedural, strategic, and unavoidable once set in motion. Junior finally stopped trying. Not out of forgiveness, not out of acceptance, but because he knew he had lost. Every move he made was anticipated, countered, and neutralized. The company remained steady, the investors reassured, the employees productive. The foundations I had built, quietly, for decades, had endured the storm of arrogance and emerged stronger. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't a shout. It isn't a headline. It's the quiet, irreversible truth that the person who underestimated you has no power, no influence, and no recourse. The corporate world is full of loud, entitled leaders who believe a title is enough. They are rarely prepared for someone like me, patient, strategic, and bulletproof. As I walked through the office that day, past employees who knew without question who was in charge, I understood it fully. True authority is invisible until it's tested. And when tested, it becomes undeniable. By now, the chaos of Junior's first day had become a legend. Employees whispered about it in hallways, investors referenced it cautiously in meetings, and even clients smirked when recounting the story of the CEO who wasn't. Yet, no one outside of our inner circle fully understood the depth of what had occurred. They saw only the surface, a young man overreaching, a seasoned executive reclaiming his office. What they didn't see was the planning, the foresight, the decades of meticulous preparation that had turned a single act of arrogance into an irreversible correction. Junior, now publicly diminished, tried one final gambit. He scheduled a meeting with several board members, hoping to argue that he should be allowed some operational control, a symbolic victory. He walked into the room full of confidence, the kind that evaporates the moment experience meets reality. "Gentlemen, I think you're underestimating the value I bring to Anchor Point Logistics," he said, voice trembling slightly, trying to mask desperation with authority. The board members, seasoned and unimpressed, exchanged quiet glances. I sat quietly at the head of the table, reviewing my notes. Every clause, every contract, every timestamped document was already prepared. No debate could undo what had been set in motion. Harold Weinstein, the board chair, finally spoke. "Junior, your position as CEO was conditional, derivative, and legally nullified the moment Section 12B was activated. Any unilateral actions you've taken are invalid. Authority rests entirely with Charles Patterson." Junior's face turned red. He stammered, searching for words, for allies, for some way to claw back a shred of control. But the board remained silent, unmoving, and the weight of my authority pressed down like a tidal wave. I finally looked up. "There is nothing left to discuss," I said calmly. "The company will continue operating under established protocols. All actions outside these protocols are null and void. Consider this the final directive." After the meeting, Junior slunk out quietly. Not escorted, not humiliated in front of clients or employees, but powerless. He knew the truth, his reputation was damaged, his authority non-existent, and his future at Anchor Point Logistics permanently limited. I let him leave. I didn't need to gloat. Revenge, when executed correctly, doesn't require theatrics. It is measured, strategic, and absolute. Every flustered email, every failed attempt at influence, every whispered complaint among employees reminded him silently of his failure. The psychological impact was perfect. Junior had everything he wanted: office, title, family recognition, and none of it meant anything. He had learned, far too late, that true authority cannot be inherited, purchased, or claimed through arrogance. With Junior neutralized, I turned fully to consolidating operations. Investors were reassured. Employees knew exactly who was in charge. Contracts, client relationships, and internal processes were reinforced. Every department head understood the chain of command. I implemented small but meaningful changes, not to assert dominance, but to stabilize and optimize the company. Junior's digital transformation initiatives were quietly replaced with operational improvements that actually increased efficiency and profitability. Leadership, I reminded myself, is not about buzzwords, it's about results. Even Bradley Sr. had come to terms with the reality. During a private meeting, he admitted, "I underestimated the importance of experience. I thought family and loyalty would suffice. But you built this in a way no one could destroy." I nodded. "I built it to last, sir. That was always the plan." Weeks turned into months. Junior eventually left the city, pursuing opportunities where no one would question his authority, ironically, in smaller companies where experience mattered less than ambition. Anchor Point Logistics thrived under my leadership, the board unanimously supportive, the investors reassured, and the employees productive and loyal. The story of that first day, the day he fired me, thinking it would mark his rise, became a cautionary tale in corporate circles. Titles are easy to give. Offices are easy to assign. But control, authority, and respect? Those are earned, documented, and, when necessary, legally protected. I often walked past my office window in the late evening, watching the city lights reflect off the building. The office was quiet, the employees gone, the systems humming smoothly. The company, the empire built over decades, was stable. And I, who had been underestimated for years, sat quietly at the helm, untouchable, unchallenged, and fully vindicated. Sometimes revenge is not loud. Sometimes it is subtle, procedural, and irreversible. And when it is executed correctly, it is absolute. Junior had learned this the hard way, and the company had survived stronger than ever. I leaned back in my chair, taking a sip of cold coffee, and smiled faintly. Patience, preparation, and quiet authority had won the day. Titles can be stolen. Offices can be reassigned. Bonuses can be slashed. But control, true control, is built, earned, and impossible to fire. And in the quiet of my office, with the city stretching beneath me, I knew this. Sometimes, the person you underestimate is the one who built the very ground everyone else is standing on. And when entitlement finally meets earned authority, justice, silent and permanent, is served.